if this particular type of aircraft has crashed, we have a responsibility to be sure that we understand what's going on with all the other aircraft. So that might have been excusable at the time. Now, I understand that there's been a whole lot more oversight, ramp inspections and mandatory random checks on airline operations since then, and that for the most part is the biggest additional safety initiative you can take, and obviously letting operators know that we will be absolutely unforgiving of violations. Remember that it is the operator's responsibility to have a safe equipment and to operate that equipment safely. Essentially what the Civil Aviation Authority is as a regulatory authority, they issue licenses. Those licenses are really the biggest tool of control, because if you're my licensee, you work within the terms of the license, and if you don't, you lose your job, or at least you lose the license. If you don't have that license, you have no basis to work for your employer, or you have no basis to operate an airline. Or
because we remember then again that the argument, because shortly after the operations were suspended, then they were allowed again, yes, you know, to go back to the skies, and there was massive protest. A lot of people were saying the report, I mean, investigation into what the cause of the accident isn't out yet, and you're already giving them back their license. And then they had to say that, you know, that is definitely not standard practice. We're seeing that happen again with Associated Airlines. Their operations have been suspended, and then on top of that, we also hear that Dana Airlines, as the operations have been suspended, to carry out an operational audit.
Good, and I think that's a very good point you raise. But it is not the release of the Accident and Investigation Bureau's report that determines whether an airline should continue to operate. For the most part, in other parts of the world, most airlines just continue to operate. The important thing is that they were complying with all the regulations. If the other aircraft in the fleet are certified or have valid airworthiness certificates, and the regulatory authority has absolutely no challenges with the qualifications of the employees or the professionals who work there, then generally they do not stop operation. But in a place like Nigeria, where, you know, we have to look at things differently, because of course there are people like us out there who would pursue legal action, I can see why you'd say, you know what, I'd like to look at this again. And if the regulatory authority is satisfied that a company's operations meet, you know, the appropriate standards, the question I would have as a lawyer also is, why would that company not be operating? Why? Because we must remember that it is possible for an accident to occur, even when everybody has done absolutely what they should do.
You know, the pilots have been complaining. This not just now, they've
Yes.
always complained, and looks like even the ministry, that was why I wanted us to also look at the aviation ministry and see if they have actually done well. Pilots complain, and I remember then we had Benson Ikomosa, a captain, a pilot, who was here then. In his words on that day, he said, Abuja Airport is one of the most breached in the world. And there was another time he also talked about landing in the airports in Lagos, in the old airport, where there were actually no lighting facility for them to land. And now we just have Captain Badamose also saying that sometimes the fatigue and stress some of these pilots go through before they get into the aircraft at our airports is something we should also look into.
And from a lawyer's standpoint, I find both complaints outrageous. I'll tell you why. My understanding of the way the system works is that the captain is literally a god when it comes to operation of an aircraft. And with what I know about the law, a captain has absolute discretion to say, you know what, I will not even start up this aircraft if I'm not satisfied with it. A captain can look at a runway and say, I am not going to land on this, I'll go to an alternate airport, I don't care where it is. And you cannot even take any the operator or the employer of that captain cannot take any retaliatory action against that captain for enforcing that level of safety. Because, and Abuja Airport, if I'm correct, still receives both domestic and international flights every day. And I know that all those captains can't possibly say, you know what, it's bad, but I have no choice. I'm going to land there. That's just absolutely impracticable. Now, with respect to fatigue, that's a carrier's response. I mean, what that pilot who's talking about fatigue is saying is pointing a very serious finger at his employer. Because for an airline that you have rest periods.
Oh, no, he was talking more specifically about the airport. I mean, you bring your vehicle in, they have to park where all the passengers park as well. And there's no reserved, exactly, you didn't know that, and none of us knew that either. And we kind of think that is a little odd. I mean, that employees, especially pilots, have nowhere to park.
I mean, I think that's quite an issue. I mean, I would imagine that almost every company, whether you're an aviation company or not, have arrangements for their staff transportation, staff parking. For instance, my firm is in Victoria Island. It's a parking nightmare. And so what we do is we've bought spaces and we pay annually for our lawyers to pull in and park their vehicles so that we can support their convenience. I think if an airline recognizes that, first, the orientation of a pilot is primary and obviously something's a priority, they should do everything possible to ensure that those pilots have the appropriate orientation. Why do you think airlines have crew transportation when the crew arrives or when they're leaving? Why do you think they take them from their hotel just in time to get on the plane? Because they know that there are rest periods, and it's very important that these people's minds are at rest for the most part of when they do their work. I mean, if I have a pilot complaining about being fatigued when he gets on the job, that's something, that carrier, I think, is irresponsible.
What about the role of the regulator in that particular sector? Because this is a heavily regulated sector. What about FAN? I mean, shouldn't FAN be worried about the fact that, you know, regular pilots who operate domestic flights have nowhere to park their vehicles?
Well, FAN is not a regulator. FAN is an operator. It's a service
provider.
An operator,
beg your pardon.
Yes, and I don't know what to say about these, because what I'm thinking would be if, for instance, using Associated as an example, I suppose that's an Associated pilot, right? I would imagine that if I were an executive of Associated, I would engage FAN. I would say, listen, I need parking space. And if I have to pay, I'll pay. I want reserved parking space. And when I go pick family up from the airport myself, and I drive into the parking lot, sometimes I have to go all the way to the back because you've got all these bars that have blocked reserved parking spaces. Obviously, some people have purchased those spaces. That's why they're reserved. So I would like to understand a little more about what has happened in that space. For instance, if there is a designated parking area that has been purchased and airport security hasn't done enough to secure that place, and you can now trace that all the way to the fatigue that occurred to the pilot before he got on the plane, and it ultimately ended up in a crash. In representing victims of that crash, I will pursue that operator, which is fine. But I would have to know a lot of that first. But I think the primary responsibility, ultimately, has to be the carrier. It has to be.
You know, we actually started our discussion, though a lawyer, we were trying to see if we could actually decipher the possible cause of this accident. But don't you think by now we should also be looking at personnel? With the Dana and almost all the air crashes, we've always come to one thing. Oh, the D check was done, the A check was okay, B, C, and everything was okay. In fact, it just came back, but it still fell from the sky. That's bottom line. So should we be talking about the NCA, the personnel rather of the NCA, as well as the personnel of these people who actually do the in-house checks for these airlines?
Absolutely. I mean, well, the first thing I'd like to say...
Well, sometimes we think we have experts, and truly, these are not experts. They're no experts.
Well, you know, I feel that way each time you introduce me as an expert in aviation law. So, but having said that, though, yes, I mean, I don't think a regulator participates in aircraft maintenance. I think that from a legal standpoint, the moment a regulator picks up a spanner or a tool and touches an aircraft, they secure liability. So a regulator's role must remain oversight. Now, with respect to flight deck crew and the possible errors, I mean, it's difficult to second-guess a pilot after the fact. You're the one who's charged with the responsibility of securing that aircraft at that time. And I think that that's an important thing. We should give deference to that, because you do not know what calls you would make faced with different circumstances. The only way to prepare pilots for what has happened is periodic simulation training. And they do a lot of that. So, you know, we can sit here, this is Monday morning, doing quarterback and saying this is what you should have done, this is what you should have done. Hindsight is always 20/20. But the question of whether sufficient personnel who have the right expertise, aircrafts are built with significant redundancies. And the vast majority of air crashes all over the world ultimately come down to human error. Now, would it mean that some of this, each time a human error occurs, that these people were unqualified? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Now, but does that mean that we shouldn't address the question of sufficient expertise in both the carriers and even the Civil Aviation Authority? No, I agree with you. I think we must continue to get the best people and train the best people. I certainly don't want to entrust myself into the hands of a poorly trained or incompetent pilot. And I certainly don't want to fly in a plane with a competent pilot who's not overseen by a competent regulatory authority. However, again, much like other things that are international in nature, the qualifications would have to be standard, regardless of where the location is.
Well, Tunde Irukara, many thanks for coming on Sunrise Daily.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, stay with us. Sunrise Daily continues after now.